You can always tell when your marriage is over. For me, it was the look Caleb gave me at Jake Whitfield's penthouse party, like I was dog drool on his Italian loafers. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. I'm Whitney Anderson, cardiac surgeon, 37 years old, and apparently not worth the designer dress I'm wearing. The irony isn't lost on me that I spend my days fixing broken hearts while mine's been shattered for years. The party was supposed to be a celebration. Jake had just closed some massive investment deal, and Jennifer Whitfield was showing off their newly renovated penthouse like it was the eighth wonder of the world. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, and enough champagne to float a yacht. The kind of party where everyone pretends to be happy while secretly calculating how much everyone else's outfit cost. I was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city lights twinkle below, when Amanda Harrison sauntered over. 23 years old, blonde, and working as an intern at Caleb's investment firm. She had that fresh-faced innocence that made older men lose their minds and their bank accounts. "Whitney, you look absolutely stunning tonight," Amanda said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "That dress must have cost a fortune." I smiled, the kind of smile I reserve for particularly difficult patients. "Thank you, Amanda. You look young." The music was loud, some trendy jazz that made conversation feel like shouting. Caleb was across the room, laughing with his business partner, Bradley Williams, and a few other men in expensive suits. They were probably discussing their latest schemes to separate wealthy widows from their retirement funds. Eleanor Hartley, Caleb's mother, materialized beside us like a Southern Belle ghost. At 62, she still carried herself like she was competing for Miss Georgia, complete with the accent that got thicker when she wanted something. "Whitney, darling," Eleanor drawled, "you simply must try the shrimp. They flew them in from Louisiana just for tonight." I wasn't hungry. I'd been surviving on coffee and Spite for the past 3 years, ever since I discovered Caleb's first affair. Not with Amanda. She was just the latest in a long line of young women who thought sleeping with a married investment banker was a career move. Tyler Coleman appeared at Amanda's side, wrapping his arm around her waist possessively. Tyler was Amanda's cousin, 28 years old, and worked as a financial analyst downtown. His wife Sarah used to be my friend, before everything went to hell. "Ladies," Tyler nodded, then looked directly at me. "Whitney, I heard about the hospital board meeting. Congratulations on the promotion." "Thank you," I replied, though the congratulations felt hollow. The promotion to head of cardiac surgery should have been the highlight of my career. Instead, it felt like a consolation prize for having the worst marriage in our social circle. The conversation continued, meaningless small talk about vacation plans and restaurant recommendations. I watched Caleb from across the room, noting how he kept checking his phone, how his eyes wandered to every attractive woman under 30. My husband had become a cliché, and I was tired of being the punchline. Jennifer Whitfield joined our little group, clutching a martini like a lifeline. At 39, she was closer to my age, but her face had that tight, stretched look that came from too much cosmetic surgery and too many prescription pills. "Did you all hear about Margaret Chin?" Jennifer whispered, leaning in conspiratorially. "The poor woman lost everything. Her investment advisor completely cleaned out her retirement accounts." Margaret Chin was 73 years old, a retired teacher who lived in our neighborhood. She'd trusted the wrong person with her life savings, and now she was facing poverty in her golden years. "That's terrible," I said, and meant it. "Do they know who was responsible?" "Some investment firm downtown," Jennifer continued. "The FBI is investigating, but you know how these things go. The money's probably in some offshore account by now." I glanced at Caleb, who was still laughing with his friends. A sick feeling settled in my stomach, the same feeling I got when I had to deliver bad news to a patient's family. The evening dragged on, filled with forced smiles and hollow conversations. I nursed a single glass of wine, watching the social dynamics play out like a nature documentary. The predators and prey, the alliances and betrayals, all dressed up in designer clothes and good manners. Around 10 o'clock, the music changed to something slower, and couples began moving to the makeshift dance floor in the center of the living room. Caleb finally approached me, his face flushed from too much whiskey. "Dance?" he asked, extending his hand without much enthusiasm. I took his hand and we moved to the dance floor. Other couples swayed around us, Jake and Jennifer, Bradley and his wife Patricia, Tyler and Sarah. Everyone looked so perfect, so happy. It was all an illusion, of course. I'd learned that happy marriages were like unicorns. Everyone talked about them, but nobody had actually seen one. "You're quiet tonight," Caleb said, his breath reeking of alcohol. "Just thinking," I replied. "About what?" I looked up at him, this man I'd married 8 years ago, this stranger who shared my bed and my bank account. About Margaret Chin. Something flickered in his eyes, gone so quickly I almost missed it. Fear, guilt. It was hard to tell in the dim lighting. "Who's Margaret Chin?" he asked, but his voice was too casual, too controlled. "The elderly woman who lost her retirement money. Jennifer was just telling us about it." Caleb's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "That's unfortunate, but these things happen. People make poor investment choices." "She didn't make poor choices, Caleb. Someone stole from her." The song ended, but we remained on the dance floor, locked in our own private confrontation. Other couples continued dancing around us, oblivious to the tension crackling between my husband and me. "You seem very interested in this woman's financial problems," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I'm interested in justice." He laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Justice? Whitney, you're a surgeon, not a detective. Maybe you should stick to what you know." That's when it happened. The moment that would change everything. Amanda Harrison stumbled slightly as she danced with some young executive, her heel catching on the marble floor. She reached out to steady herself, accidentally bumping into Caleb's back. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she giggled, clearly having had too much champagne. Caleb turned around, and I saw his face transform. The cold indifference he'd been showing me melted away, replaced by warmth and concern. "Are you all right?" he asked Amanda, his hands moving to steady her. "I'm fine, thanks to you," she said, batting her eyelashes. I stood there, watching my husband's hands linger on another woman's waist, watching him smile at her the way he used to smile at me. The humiliation burned in my chest like acid. "Caleb," I said quietly. He didn't even look at me. He was completely focused on Amanda, asking if she needed some water, if she wanted to sit down, playing the concerned gentleman while his wife stood 3 feet away, invisible. "Caleb," I said again, louder this time. Finally, he glanced at me, irritation flashing across his features. "What, Whitney? We should go home?" "The party's just getting started," he said, his arm still around Amanda's waist. "Why don't you call an Uber if you're tired?" The conversations around us had stopped. I could feel eyes watching, waiting to see what the cardiac surgeon would do when her husband publicly dismissed her for a woman young enough to be their daughter. I looked at Amanda, who had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. Then I looked at Caleb, really looked at him, and saw a stranger, a man who would humiliate his wife at a party, who would steal from elderly women, who would throw away everything we'd built together for a few moments of validation from a girl who wasn't even born when we started dating. "You know what, Caleb?" I said, my voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room. "You're absolutely right. I should go home. But first, I think everyone here should know exactly what kind of man you really are." I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. For 3 years, I'd been gathering evidence, documenting his affairs, tracking his financial irregularities. I'd been preparing for this moment without even realizing it. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, my voice steady and clear, I'd like to share something with you all. 3 years earlier, I'd been blissfully ignorant. Well, not blissfully. I'd suspected Caleb was cheating, but I'd chosen to focus on my career instead of confronting the truth. It was easier to lose myself in 12-hour surgeries than to deal with my crumbling marriage. The wake-up call came from an unexpected source: my mother. Whitney Anderson had been an accountant for 40 years before retiring, and she still did the books for several small businesses. She had a nose for financial irregularities that could sniff out fraud from 3 states away. "Whitney, honey," she'd said during our monthly lunch at the country club, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to promise me you'll answer honestly." I'd been picking at my salad, thinking about a complex valve replacement I had scheduled for the following morning. "Sure, Mom, what is it?" "Are you and Caleb having money problems?" The question caught me off guard. "Money problems? Mom, we're fine. Better than fine, actually. Caleb just got promoted to senior partner, and my salary—" "That's what I thought," she interrupted, her voice grim. "Which is why I'm confused about your tax returns." She'd pulled out a folder, the kind she used for her business clients, and spread several documents across the white linen tablecloth. Tax returns, bank statements, investment portfolios, all bearing Caleb's signature. "I've been doing your taxes for years," she continued, "and something doesn't add up. Your reported income should put you in a much higher tax bracket, but somehow you're paying less than you should. Either Caleb is hiding income, or he's claiming deductions that don't exist." I'd stared at the papers, the numbers swimming before my eyes. "Maybe he's just being aggressive with the deductions. That's not illegal, is it?" "Aggressive is one thing. This looks like fraud." The word hung between us like a curse. Fraud. My husband, the respected investment banker, the man who advised wealthy clients on how to protect their assets, was potentially a criminal. That night, I'd confronted Caleb in our home office, a converted bedroom on the 2nd floor of our colonial house. He'd been working late, as usual, surrounded by files and spreadsheets. "We need to talk," I'd said, closing the door behind me. He'd looked up from his laptop, annoyed at the interruption. "Can it wait? I'm in the middle of something important." "More important than your wife?" Something in my tone must have warned him, because his expression shifted from annoyance to caution. "What's this about, Whitney?" I'd sat down across from him, the mahogany desk that had belonged to his father, creating a barrier between us. "My mother has some questions about our taxes." "Your mother needs to mind her own business. Our finances are my business, Caleb. I'm your wife. And I'm the one who handles the money in this family. Has that been a problem?" It was a reasonable question. I'd always been happy to let Caleb manage our investments and taxes. I was busy with my medical practice, and he was the financial expert. It made sense to divide the responsibilities. But now I was wondering if my trust had been misplaced. "Show me the books," I'd said. "Excuse me?" "Our accounts, our investments, our tax strategy. I want to see everything." Caleb had leaned back in his leather chair, studying me with cold eyes. "Since when are you interested in financial planning?" "Since my mother told me we might be committing tax fraud." The accusation had hung in the air between us. I'd watched Caleb's face, looking for signs of guilt or innocence. What I'd seen was calculation. "Your mother is a small-town bookkeeper who does taxes for hair salons and pizza shops," he'd said finally. "She doesn't understand complex investment strategies." "Then explain it to me." "Whitney, I've been managing money for 15 years. I have clients who trust me with millions of dollars. Do you really think I'd jeopardize my career and our future for a few $1,000s in tax savings?" When he put it that way, it sounded ridiculous, but my mother wasn't prone to paranoia, and she'd been doing taxes longer than Caleb had been alive. "Just show me the accounts," I'd insisted. That's when I'd seen it, a flash of something dark and angry in his eyes. It was gone in an instant, replaced by his usual charming smile, but I'd caught it. The mask had slipped, just for a moment. "Of course," he'd said, his voice warm and reasonable. "I'll put together a summary for you this weekend. But Whitney, I need you to trust me. We're a team, remember?" He'd never shown me those accounts. Instead, I'd started my own investigation. It began innocently enough. I'd simply started paying attention to our bank statements, our credit card bills, our investment portfolios. What I had discovered sent a chill down my spine. There were accounts I'd never heard of, investments in companies that didn't seem to exist, and transfers to offshore banks that Caleb had never mentioned. Our financial life was a maze of shell companies and hidden assets, all designed to obscure the trail of money flowing in and out of our accounts. I'd hired my own forensic accountant, a woman named Linda Martinez, who specialized in uncovering hidden assets in divorce cases. Linda had worked quietly, carefully, building a picture of Caleb's financial empire that was both impressive and terrifying. "Mrs. Anderson," Linda had said during our third meeting, "your husband is running what appears to be a sophisticated money laundering operation. He's taking money from his clients, moving it through a series of shell companies, and then returning a portion to them as investment returns while keeping a significant percentage for himself." "That's impossible," I'd said, but even as the words left my mouth, I'd known they weren't true. It explained the expensive cars, the lavish vacations, the designer clothes. It explained why Caleb always paid for everything in cash. "It's actually quite clever," Linda had continued. "His clients think they're getting excellent returns on their investments, so they keep giving him more money to manage. They don't realize that their profits are actually coming from other clients' principal investments." "You're describing a Ponzi scheme." "Exactly. And based on the numbers I've seen, it's a big one. Your husband is managing at least $50 million in client assets, possibly more." The room had started spinning. $50 million. Margaret Chin's retirement savings were just a drop in that ocean. "What happens when it collapses?" I'd asked. "People lose everything. Retirement accounts, college funds, life savings, all of it disappears. And the person running the scheme usually ends up in federal prison for 20 to 30 years. That night, I'd gone home to our beautiful house in our perfect neighborhood and looked at my husband with new eyes. Caleb had been in the kitchen, making himself a sandwich, humming some tune I didn't recognize. "How was your day?" he'd asked, the same question he asked every night. "Fine," I'd replied, the same answer I gave every night. But nothing was fine. My husband was a criminal, my marriage was a sham, and I was complicit in the destruction of innocent people's lives simply by staying silent. That's when I'd started gathering evidence in earnest. Phone recordings, document copies, financial statements, anything that might help the authorities when the inevitable collapse came. I'd told myself I was protecting the victims, but deep down I'd known the truth. I was preparing for war. The evidence had piled up over the months. Caleb's affairs, his financial crimes, his lies and deceptions, all of it carefully documented and stored in a safety deposit box across town. I'd become a detective in my own marriage, and what I'd discovered had sickened me. But I'd also discovered something else. I wasn't the only one who suspected Caleb was dirty. Eleanor Hartley, Caleb's own mother, had been conducting her own investigation. I'd found out by accident when I'd seen her meeting with a private investigator at a coffee shop downtown. The irony was delicious. The woman who had spent years criticizing me for not being good enough for her son was the one who would ultimately bring him down. It turned out that Eleanor had been receiving anonymous tips about Caleb's activities for months. Someone was feeding her information, someone who wanted Caleb exposed but didn't want to do it themselves. I'd never found out who the whistleblower was, but I'd had my suspicions. Bradley Williams, Caleb's business partner, had been acting nervous lately. Patricia Williams, Bradley's wife, had been asking pointed questions about their finances. Even Amanda Harrison had seemed troubled, though I'd assumed that was because Caleb had been promising to leave me for her and hadn't followed through. The truth was, Caleb's empire was crumbling from within. His partners were getting suspicious, his clients were asking questions, and his family was turning against him. All he'd needed was one final push to send the whole thing tumbling down. That push had come at Jake Whitfield's party, when he'd humiliated me in front of our entire social circle. He'd given me the perfect opportunity to destroy him, and I'd taken it. Standing in that penthouse, surrounded by the people who had enabled his crimes through their silence and complicity, I'd felt a surge of power, unlike anything I'd experienced in the operating room. "Ladies and gentlemen," I'd announced, holding up my phone, "I think it's time you all knew the truth about Caleb Hartley." The silence in Jake Whitfield's penthouse was deafening. 50 of the city's most prominent residents stood frozen, champagne glasses halfway to their lips, waiting to see what the scorned wife would do next. I looked around the room, taking in the faces of people I'd called friends for years. Jennifer Whitfield, clutching her martini with white knuckles. Bradley Williams, his face pale as parchment. Patricia Williams, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and anticipation. And Eleanor Hartley, standing near the bar with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Whitney," Caleb said, his voice tight with warning, "I think you've had too much to drink. Maybe we should—" "I've had exactly one glass of wine," I interrupted, my voice carrying clearly across the marble floors, "which is more than I can say for your sobriety when it comes to other people's money." A collective intake of breath rippled through the crowd. Amanda Harrison stepped away from Caleb, suddenly realizing she didn't want to be standing too close to ground zero. I opened my phone and scrolled to a folder I'd labeled Insurance. 3 years of evidence, carefully organized and documented, bank statements, recorded phone calls, photographs, email screenshots, enough evidence to bury Caleb and half the people in this room. 3 years ago, I began, my voice steady and clinical, I discovered that my husband was having an affair, not with Amanda. She's just the latest in a long line of young women who mistake sleeping with a married man for career advancement. Amanda's face turned scarlet. Several people turned to stare at her, and she looked like she wanted to disappear into the marble floor. "But infidelity is common," I continued. "What's less common is systematic financial fraud designed to steal retirement savings from elderly clients." The room erupted in whispers. I saw several people reaching for their phones, probably texting their own financial advisors or calling their lawyers. "Margaret Chin," I said, and the whispers stopped. 73 years old, retired teacher, lost her entire retirement account to an investment scam. The FBI is investigating, as Jennifer mentioned earlier. What Jennifer doesn't know is that the investment firm they're investigating is Hartley, Williams and Associates. Bradley Williams dropped his whiskey glass. It shattered on the marble floor, the sound echoing through the suddenly silent room like a gunshot. "That's enough," Caleb said, moving toward me. "Whitney, you're making a fool of yourself." "Am I?" I held up my phone, showing the screen to the crowd. "Because I have bank records showing transfers from Margaret Chin's retirement account to a shell company called Sunset Investments, which is owned by another shell company called Pacific Holdings, which is owned by... Well, you get the idea. It all leads back to you, Caleb." Eleanor Hartley stepped forward, her southern accent completely gone. "Whitney, dear, perhaps this isn't the appropriate venue for—" "Oh, but it's the perfect venue, Eleanor," I said, turning to face my mother-in-law. "Because everyone here is either a victim or an accomplice. Jake, how much money do you have invested with Hartley, Williams, and Associates?" Jake Whitfield's face went ashen. "I don't think that's any of your business." $2.7 million, I said, reading from my phone. "At least, that's what your statements show. But the actual cash in your account is closer to 400,000. The rest is just numbers on paper, backed by other people's money." Jennifer Whitfield swayed on her feet. "Jake, tell me she's lying." Jake looked like he was going to be sick. We need to talk privately. There's no privacy anymore, I said. Tyler, your cousin Amanda is pregnant. Did you know that? She's been sleeping with my husband for 6 months, thinking he was going to leave me and marry her. Instead, he's been promising her a job at his company that's about to be raided by the FBI. Tyler Coleman's face darkened as he turned to stare at Amanda. Is that true? Amanda burst into tears. Tyler, I can explain. Can you explain why you've been stealing prescription pills from Jennifer's medicine cabinet? I continued. Because I have security footage from 3 different parties where you've been rifling through bathroom cabinets looking for opioids. Jennifer Whitfield dropped her martini glass. It joined Bradley's whiskey glass in a puddle of alcohol and broken crystal on the marble floor. My pills, Jennifer whispered. I thought I was going crazy. I kept running out early, but I was sure I hadn't taken them all. You weren't going crazy, I assured her. You were being robbed by a drug addict who was also sleeping with my husband and stealing money from elderly clients. It's quite the resume. The crowd was buzzing now, conversations breaking out in small groups as people processed the information I was dumping on them. Some were pulling out phones to call lawyers or accountants. Others were edging toward the exits. Sarah, I called out, spotting Tyler's wife near the windows. I'm sorry you had to find out this way, but your husband has been helping Caleb move money through cryptocurrency accounts. The digital wallet addresses are all registered to Tyler's name, which means when the FBI comes knocking, he's going to be the one holding the bag. Sarah Coleman stared at her husband in horror. Tyler, what is she talking about? Tyler's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. It wasn't. We were just trying to diversify the investment portfolio. By laundering money through Bitcoin, I laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Tyler, you're 28 years old with a master's degree in finance. Don't insult everyone's intelligence by pretending you didn't know what you were doing. Patricia Williams had been standing quietly near her husband, but now she spoke up. Bradley, is this true? Have you been stealing from clients? Bradley Williams looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past 10 minutes. Patricia, it's complicated. The market has been volatile, and we were just trying to maintain consistent returns for our investors. By running a Ponzi scheme, I clarified. The technical term is securities fraud, but Ponzi scheme is more accurate. You take money from new investors to pay returns to existing investors, skimming a percentage off the top for yourselves. It works great until you run out of new investors, and then everyone loses everything. I looked around the room, taking in the faces of people whose lives I was systematically destroying. A year ago, I might have felt guilty. Tonight, I felt nothing but satisfaction. The FBI will be making arrests on Monday, I announced. I've been working with Agent Patterson for the past 6 months, providing evidence and testimony in exchange for immunity. Everyone in this room who has money invested with Hartley, Williams and Associates should contact their lawyers immediately. Everyone who has been helping launder money should probably do the same. Eleanor Hartley stepped forward again, and I saw something in her eyes that surprised me. Relief. Whitney, she said quietly, I need to tell you something. What's that, Eleanor? I've been the one sending anonymous tips to the FBI. The room went completely silent. Caleb stared at his mother in shock, his face cycling through disbelief, anger, and betrayal. Mum, he said, his voice barely a whisper. What are you talking about? Eleanor straightened her shoulders, every inch the southern matriarch. I've known about your activities for over a year, Caleb. I hired a private investigator when I started receiving complaints from friends whose investments weren't performing as promised. When I realized what you were doing, I had a choice: protect my son or protect innocent people from being victimized. So you chose to destroy your own family? Caleb's voice was rising, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking. I chose to stop you before you destroyed more families, Eleanor replied. Margaret Chin is my bridge partner, Caleb. Dorothy Patterson is my neighbor. These aren't just names on account statements. They're real people whose lives you've ruined. The confrontation between mother and son was mesmerizing. 8 years of marriage, and I'd never seen Caleb lose control like this. His face was flushed, his hands shaking with rage. "You sanctimonious person," he snarled at his mother. "You've lived off my money for years. The house, the cars, the country club membership. Where do you think that all came from?" "I thought it came from honest work," Eleanor shot back. "I didn't realize I was living off stolen retirement funds." That's when Caleb completely lost it. He lunged toward his mother, and I stepped between them without thinking. 8 years of martial arts training kicked in, and I grabbed his wrist, twisting it just enough to stop his forward momentum. "Don't," I said quietly. "There are 50 witnesses here, and half of them have their phones out recording. Do you really want to add assault to your list of charges?" Caleb stared at me, breathing hard, and for a moment I thought he might take a swing at me instead. But then he seemed to realize where he was, what he was doing, and who was watching. He straightened his tie, smoothed back his hair, and tried to salvage what was left of his dignity. "This is all lies," he announced to the room. "My wife is having a mental breakdown, and my mother is suffering from dementia. None of this is true." "Really?" I pulled out my phone again and tapped the screen. Suddenly, Caleb's voice filled the room, crystal clear through the penthouse's sound system. "The old woman will never know what hit her. By the time she realizes her account is empty, the money will be in the Caymans, and there won't be a damn thing she can do about it." It was a recording from 3 months ago, Caleb talking to Bradley in their office about Margaret Chin's account. I'd hidden a digital recorder in Caleb's briefcase, and the audio quality was perfect. The room erupted in chaos. Several people started shouting at once, others were making phone calls, and a few were heading for the exits. Amanda Harrison was sobbing in the corner, while Tyler Coleman screamed at her about destroying his marriage and his career. Through it all, Caleb stood in the center of the room like the eye of a hurricane, finally seeing his world collapse around him. "The FBI will be here shortly," I announced over the noise. Agent Patterson wanted to give everyone a chance to hear the truth before the arrests begin. I'd suggest using that time wisely. The chaos in Jake Whitfield's penthouse was beautiful to watch. 50 of the city's elite, people who prided themselves on their composure and social graces, were falling apart like a house of cards in a windstorm. Jennifer Whitfield was hyperventilating into a paper bag, while Jake tried to calculate how much money they were about to lose. Bradley Williams was on his phone with what I assumed was his lawyer, speaking in urgent whispers. Patricia Williams was gathering her purse and coat, clearly planning to distance herself from her husband as quickly as possible. Tyler Coleman had cornered Amanda Harrison near the bar, their argument growing more heated by the minute. "You stupid little slut," Tyler was saying, his face red with rage. "Do you have any idea what you've done to my family?" "I didn't know," Amanda sobbed. "I thought he loved me. He said he was going to leave Whitney and marry me." "He's a married man, Amanda. A married man who's about to go to federal prison. And now I'm going with him because you convinced me to help with those cryptocurrency transfers." Sarah Coleman approached her husband from behind, her face cold as ice. "Tyler, we're leaving. Now." "Sarah, I can explain." The sound of Sarah's hand connecting with Tyler's cheek echoed through the penthouse like a gunshot. Several conversations stopped as people turned to watch the drama unfold. "Don't," Sarah said, her voice quiet. "Don't say another word. We're going home, you're packing a bag, and you're leaving. I'll file for divorce on Monday, right after I call the FBI to tell them everything I know about your little cryptocurrency scheme." Tyler's face crumpled. "Sarah, please, I was trying to provide for our family." "By stealing from old people, by laundering money for criminals." Sarah's voice was rising now, carrying across the marble floors. "Tyler, I'm a kindergarten teacher. Do you know what happens to kindergarten teachers who are married to federal criminals? I lose my job. I lose my pension. I lose everything because my husband decided to become a white-collar gangster." She turned and walked toward the elevator, not bothering to see if Tyler was following. He stood there for a moment, looking lost, then hurried after her. "Sarah, wait, please." The elevator doors closed on their argument, leaving the rest of us to deal with the remaining chaos. Eleanor Hartley had found a chair and was sitting quietly, looking older than her 62 years. The confrontation with Caleb had taken something out of her, and I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "Eleanor," I said, approaching her carefully, "are you all right?" She looked up at me with tired eyes. "I've been dreading this night for months, Whitney. I knew it was coming, but I didn't think it would be quite so dramatic." "You could have warned me," I said. "We could have worked together." "Could we?" Eleanor's southern accent was creeping back, a sign that she was under stress. "Whitney, honey, we haven't exactly been close over the years. I wasn't sure whose side you were on." It was a fair point. Eleanor and I had maintained a polite but distant relationship throughout my marriage to Caleb. She'd never thought I was good enough for her son, and I'd never particularly cared what she thought. "I've been on my own side," I said, "but it turns out that means I'm on the side of justice." Eleanor smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face. "I'm glad to hear that. I was worried you might try to protect him." "Protect him?" I laughed. "Eleanor, your son has been systematically destroying my life for years. The affairs, the lies, the financial crimes. I've been documenting all of it. The only reason I didn't turn him in sooner was because I wanted to make sure I had enough evidence to bury him completely." "Well," Eleanor said, looking around at the chaos surrounding us, "I'd say you've succeeded." Across the room, Caleb was trying to rally support from the remaining guests. He'd cornered Jake and Bradley, speaking to them in urgent whispers. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but their body language told the story. Jake kept shaking his head, and Bradley looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. "He's trying to convince them to stick together," I observed. "Present a united front, claim it's all a misunderstanding." "It won't work," Eleanor said. "Jake has too much to lose, and Bradley is too smart to go down with a sinking ship." As if to prove her point, Bradley Williams broke away from the group and headed toward the elevator. Jake followed, leaving Caleb standing alone near the windows. For a moment, I felt something that might have been pity. Caleb looked lost, abandoned by his friends and family, facing the collapse of everything he'd built. Then I remembered Margaret Chin, living on Social Security because her retirement fund had been stolen. The pity evaporated. Amanda Harrison approached me cautiously, her mascara streaked down her cheeks. "Whitney, I need to talk to you." "I'm listening." "I didn't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "About the money laundering, about the other women. He told me you two were separated, that the divorce was almost final." "And you believed him?" Amanda's face crumpled. "I wanted to believe him. He was so charming, so confident. He made me feel special." "You're 23 years old, Amanda. What did you think a 40-year-old married man wanted from you? Your sparkling personality?" It was cruel, but I was past caring about Amanda's feelings. She'd made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. "I'm pregnant," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "It's his baby. I don't know what to do." I stared at her, processing this information. Caleb's baby. Another complication in an already complicated situation. "Have you told him?" "I tried to tonight. Before all this happened, he said he'd pay for an abortion and that we needed to stop seeing each other. He said you were getting suspicious and he couldn't afford any complications right now." The irony was almost funny. Caleb was worried about me getting suspicious while I was busy gathering evidence to send him to federal prison. "What are you going to do?" I asked. "I don't know," Amanda admitted. "I can't afford to raise a baby on my own, but I don't know if I can go through with an abortion. And now, with everything that's happened tonight—" "You need to talk to the FBI," I said. "Agent Patterson will want to interview everyone who has information about Caleb's activities. Your cooperation might help reduce any charges you're facing." "Charges?" Amanda's eyes widened. "What charges? I didn't steal any money." You helped facilitate the scheme by providing information about clients, you stole prescription drugs from Jennifer Whitfield, and you were sleeping with your boss, which is sexual harassment even if you were a willing participant. Amanda, you're not just a victim here, you're also a perpetrator. The truth hit her like a physical blow. She staggered backward, her hand pressed to her mouth. I need to go, she whispered. I need to call my parents. She hurried toward the elevator, leaving me alone with the remaining guests. The party had thinned out considerably. Most people had fled as soon as they realized the scope of the scandal, probably rushing home to call their lawyers and accountants. Jennifer Whitfield was still hyperventilating, but the paper bag seemed to be helping. Jake was on his phone, presumably with his financial advisor, trying to figure out how much money they were about to lose. Eleanor Hartley stood up from her chair and approached me. Whitney, I owe you an apology. For what? For never giving you the credit you deserved. I thought you were just a pretty face who had trapped my son into marriage. I didn't realize you were smart enough to outmaneuver him. I'm a cardiac surgeon, Eleanor. I didn't get here by being stupid. No, she agreed. You certainly didn't. The elevator doors opened, and my heart skipped a beat. Agent Patterson stepped out, followed by 3 other FBI agents. She was exactly as I'd imagined from our phone conversations. Mid-50s, grey hair pulled back in a severe bun, wearing a no-nonsense pantsuit that screamed federal law enforcement. Ladies and gentlemen, Agent Patterson announced, her voice carrying easily across the marble floors. I'm Agent Patterson with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have warrants for the arrest of Caleb Hartley, Bradley Williams, and Tyler Coleman on charges of securities fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. The remaining party guests froze like deer in headlights. Agent Patterson's colleagues spread out through the room, professional and efficient. Caleb Hartley, Agent Patterson called out. Caleb stepped forward, his face pale but composed. I'm Caleb Hartley. Mr. Hartley, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit securities fraud, money laundering, and operating an unlicensed investment scheme. You have the right to remain silent. As Agent Patterson read Caleb his rights, I felt a surge of satisfaction unlike anything I'd ever experienced. 8 years of marriage, 3 years of investigation, and countless hours of gathering evidence had led to this moment. Caleb's eyes met mine as the handcuffs clicked into place. For a moment, I saw the man I'd married, the charming investment banker who had swept me off my feet with expensive dinners and romantic gestures. Then the mask slipped away, and I saw the real Caleb, cold, calculating, and completely without remorse. This isn't over, Whitney, he said quietly, as Agent Patterson led him toward the elevator. Yes, it is, I replied. It's been over for years. I'm just making it official. The elevator doors closed on my husband, and I realized I felt nothing but relief. No sadness, no regret, no second thoughts, just the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. Agent Patterson approached me as her colleagues continued processing the scene. Mrs. Anderson, thank you for your cooperation in this investigation. Your evidence was instrumental in building our case. Thank you for listening to me, I said. I wasn't sure anyone would believe me. When someone brings us 3 years of documented evidence, we tend to pay attention, Agent Patterson replied with a slight smile. You should consider a career in law enforcement. You're a natural investigator. I laughed. I think I'll stick to surgery. It's less complicated. As the FBI agents finished their work and the last of the party guests fled, I found myself alone in Jake Whitfield's penthouse with Eleanor Hartley. The marble floors were littered with broken glass and abandoned champagne flutes, the detritus of a party that had gone spectacularly wrong. Well, Eleanor said, looking around at the destruction, I don't think we'll be invited back here anytime soon. Probably not, I agreed. We stood there in comfortable silence, 2 women who had finally found common ground in the ruins of Caleb Hartley's empire. The next 6 months passed in a blur of depositions, court hearings, and media attention. The Hartley scandal, as the newspapers called it, became the biggest financial crime story of the year. $50 million in stolen assets, dozens of victims, and a web of corruption that reached into the highest levels of the city's social elite. I testified before a grand jury, giving detailed testimony about Caleb's criminal activities and my 3-year investigation. The prosecutors were impressed with the quality of evidence I'd gathered, and several of them suggested I consider a career change. "You're wasted in medicine," Assistant District Attorney Rebecca Walsh told me after one particularly long deposition. "With your attention to detail and investigative skills, you'd make an excellent prosecutor." It was tempting, but I loved surgery too much to give it up. There was something satisfying about fixing hearts that couldn't be found in any courtroom. The media attention was overwhelming at first. Reporters camped outside my house, called my office, and followed me to the grocery store. The story had everything journalists loved: wealthy criminals, betrayed wives, and enough scandal to fill a dozen tabloid headlines. I gave exactly one interview to a respected financial journalist who had been covering white-collar crime for 20 years. I wanted to make sure the victims' stories were told properly, that Margaret Chin and the other elderly clients weren't forgotten in the sensational details of Caleb's affairs and lavish lifestyle. "The real tragedy isn't that my husband was unfaithful," I told the journalist. "It's that he stole the retirement savings of people who trusted him." Margaret Chin worked for 40 years as a teacher, saving every penny for her golden years. She'll never get that money back, no matter how many people go to prison. The article ran on the front page of the financial section, with a photo of Margaret Chin sitting in her modest apartment, surrounded by the bills she could no longer afford to pay. It generated more sympathy and outrage than all the sensational coverage combined. The trials began 8 months after the arrests. Caleb, Bradley Williams, and Tyler Coleman were prosecuted together, facing dozens of charges related to securities fraud and money laundering. The prosecution's case was overwhelming, built on the foundation of evidence I'd spent 3 years collecting. I testified for 2 full days, walking the jury through bank records, recorded conversations, and financial documents that painted a clear picture of the conspiracy. Caleb's defense attorney tried to portray me as a vindictive wife seeking revenge, but the evidence spoke for itself. "Mrs. Anderson," the defense attorney said during cross-examination, "isn't it true that you were motivated by anger over your husband's infidelities rather than genuine concern for his clients?" "I was motivated by justice," I replied calmly. "My husband's affairs were painful, but his theft of retirement funds from elderly clients was criminal. I couldn't stand by and watch innocent people lose their life savings." "But you waited 3 years to come forward. If you were truly concerned about the victims, why didn't you contact authorities immediately?" It was a fair question, one I'd asked myself many times. I needed to gather enough evidence to ensure a conviction. These are sophisticated financial crimes, and I wanted to make sure the authorities had everything they needed to build an airtight case. The prosecutor, Rebecca Walsh, handled the redirect examination. "Mrs. Anderson, during those 3 years of investigation, did you benefit financially from your husband's criminal activities?" "No. I maintained separate bank accounts and paid my own expenses. I also donated my share of any suspicious income to charity, specifically to organizations that help elderly victims of financial fraud." It was true. Every penny that I suspected came from illegal sources had been donated to the National Center for Elder Abuse and similar organizations. I'd kept meticulous records, knowing that my own financial integrity would be scrutinized. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Caleb was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Bradley Williams got 15 years. Tyler Coleman, who had cooperated with prosecutors and provided additional evidence, received 8 years. I wasn't in the courtroom when the sentences were announced. I'd said everything I needed to say during the trial, and I didn't need to see Caleb's face when he learned he'd be spending the next quarter-century behind bars. Instead, I was at the hospital, performing a complex valve replacement on a 70-year-old woman whose heart had been damaged by years of untreated high pressure. It was delicate work, requiring absolute focus and precision. As I sutured the new valve into place, I thought about second chances and the possibility of redemption. My patient would recover fully and live many more years with her new heart. Caleb's victims would never fully recover from their financial losses, but at least they had the satisfaction of seeing justice done. After the surgery, I found Eleanor Hartley waiting in my office. She looked older than her 63 years, worn down by the stress of the trial and the shame of her son's crimes. "Whitney," she said, standing up as I entered, "I wanted to thank you." "For what?" "For doing what I couldn't do, for having the courage to stop him." I sat down behind my desk, studying my former mother-in-law. The trial had changed our relationship, transforming us from polite adversaries into reluctant allies. "You did stop him, Eleanor. Your tips to the FBI were crucial to the investigation. But I should have done more sooner. I knew something was wrong for years, but I kept hoping he'd come to his senses on his own. He's your son. It's natural to want to protect him." Eleanor shook her head. "I wasn't protecting him. I was protecting myself, my reputation, my social standing, my comfortable lifestyle. I was as selfish as he was, in my own way." It was a brutally honest assessment, and I respected her for making it. "What will you do now?" I asked. "I'm selling the house and moving to Florida. I want to be closer to my sister, and I need to get away from all the memories here. I'm also setting up a trust fund for the victims, using whatever assets the government doesn't seize." It was a generous gesture, though it wouldn't come close to making the victims whole. "What about Amanda's baby?" Eleanor's face softened. "She decided to keep it. The baby is due in 3 months. I've offered to help financially, for the child's sake. It's not the baby's fault that Caleb is the father." Amanda Harrison had largely disappeared from public view after the trial. She'd cooperated with prosecutors and avoided serious charges, but her reputation was destroyed. The last I'd heard, she was living with her parents in a small town outside the city, working as a waitress and trying to put her life back together. "That's very generous of you," I said. "It's the least I can do. That child is my grandchild, regardless of the circumstances of its conception." Eleanor stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Whitney, I hope you can find happiness. You deserve better than what my son put you through." After she left, I sat alone in my office, thinking about the past year and the changes it had brought. The divorce had been finalized 3 months earlier, a simple matter since all of Caleb's assets had been seized by the government. I'd kept the house, my medical practice, and my dignity. It was more than enough. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Rebecca Walsh, the prosecutor who had handled Caleb's case. "Whitney, I have a proposition for you," she said without preamble. "The Attorney General's office is starting a new white-collar crime unit, and we need someone with your investigative skills and medical background. There are a lot of healthcare fraud cases that require someone who understands both medicine and finance. Rebecca, I appreciate the offer, but I'm happy where I am. Think about it. You could help prosecute doctors who defraud Medicare, pharmaceutical companies that inflate drug prices, medical device manufacturers who hide safety data. You could make a real difference." It was tempting. The idea of using my skills to fight corruption in my own profession appealed to me. But surgery was my first love, and I wasn't ready to give it up. "Let me think about it," I said. "Fair enough. The offer stands whenever you're ready." After hanging up, I looked out my office window at the city skyline. Somewhere out there, Margaret Chin was living in a smaller apartment, stretching her Social Security check to cover rent and groceries. Somewhere else, Caleb was adjusting to life in a federal prison, probably still convinced that he was the victim of an unfair system. Justice had been served, but it felt incomplete. The money was gone, scattered through offshore accounts and shell companies that would take years to unravel. The victims would receive some compensation from asset seizures and insurance claims, but they'd never be made whole. Still, I'd done what I could. I'd exposed the truth, helped convict the criminals, and prevented future victims from being defrauded. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was real justice, messy and complicated, and ultimately satisfying. My pager buzzed, alerting me to an emergency in the cardiac unit. A heart attack patient was coming in by ambulance, and they needed me in surgery immediately. I grabbed my surgical coat and headed for the elevator, leaving behind thoughts of prosecutors and prison sentences. I had hearts to fix, lives to save, and a future to build. The revenge was complete, but the healing was just beginning. 2 years after Caleb's conviction, I was finally ready to close the last chapter of our story. The media attention had died down, the legal proceedings were finished, and I'd rebuilt my life on my own terms. But there was one final confrontation that needed to happen. Caleb had been requesting visits for months, sending letters through his attorney, asking me to come to the federal prison where he was serving his sentence. I'd ignored them all, having no interest in whatever manipulation or plea for forgiveness he was planning. But then Margaret Chin died. She passed away quietly in her sleep, in the small apartment she'd been forced to move to after losing her retirement savings. The funeral was small, attended by a few former colleagues and neighbors. I was one of the pallbearers, carrying the casket of a woman I'd never met, but whose story had changed my life. After the service, I made a decision. I would visit Caleb one final time, not for his sake, but for Margaret's. She deserved to have someone tell her story to the man who had destroyed her final years. The federal prison was a 3-hour drive from the city, a sprawling complex of concrete and razor wire in the middle of nowhere. I dressed carefully for the visit, choosing a simple black dress that was professional but not provocative. I wanted Caleb to see me as I was now, successful, independent, and completely beyond his reach. The visiting room was exactly what I'd expected from movies and television shows. Plastic chairs, fluorescent lighting, and the constant hum of surveillance cameras. Guards stood at strategic positions, watching for any signs of trouble. Caleb appeared after a few minutes, wearing an orange jumpsuit that made his skin look sallow. Prison had aged him dramatically. His hair was graying, his face was thinner, and he moved with the careful posture of someone who'd learned to be constantly aware of potential threats. He sat down across from me, separated by a small table that might as well have been an ocean. "Whitney," he said, his voice softer than I remembered. "Thank you for coming." "I didn't come for you," I replied. "I came for Margaret Chin." His face tightened at the mention of her name. "I heard about her passing. I'm sorry." "Are you? Are you really sorry that a 73-year-old woman died in poverty because you stole her retirement savings?" Caleb looked around the visiting room, perhaps checking to see if anyone was listening. "Whitney, I know you hate me. I know I made mistakes." "Mistakes?" I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Caleb, you didn't make mistakes. You made choices. You chose to steal from elderly clients. You chose to have affairs with young employees. You chose to lie to me for years while I slept next to you every night." "I was trying to provide for us," he said weakly. "The pressure to maintain our lifestyle, to keep up appearances." "Our lifestyle?" I laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Caleb, I was making $400,000 a year as a cardiac surgeon. We didn't need stolen money to maintain our lifestyle. You stole because you're a greedy, selfish man who thought he was smarter than everyone else." He flinched as if I'd slapped him. "Whitney, please. I've had 2 years to think about what I did. I know I hurt you. I know I hurt innocent people. If I could take it all back—" "But you can't," I interrupted. "Margaret Chin is gone. Dorothy Patterson lost her house. James Mitchell had to come out of retirement at 78 because you stole his pension fund. You can't take any of that back." Tears were running down Caleb's face now, and I felt nothing but contempt. Where were those tears when he was transferring money out of retirement accounts? Where was that remorse when he was lying to my face about working late while he was actually in hotel rooms with Amanda Harrison? "I think about those people every day," he said. "I know I can never make it right, but I want you to know that I'm sorry. I'm truly, deeply sorry." "Your apology is 23 years too late," I said, standing up from the plastic chair. "That's how long you'll be in here, if you serve your full sentence. Margaret Chin didn't live to see you serve even 2 years. Whitney, wait." Caleb reached across the table, but I stepped back before he could touch me. "I still love you. I know I have no right to say that, but it's true. You were the best thing in my life, and I threw it all away." I looked down at this broken man in his orange jumpsuit, and I felt the last of my anger drain away. He wasn't worth my hatred anymore. He was just a pathetic criminal who would spend the next 2 decades paying for his crimes. "Caleb," I said quietly, "I don't love you. I don't hate you. I don't think about you at all anymore. You're irrelevant to my life." It was the cruelest thing I could have said, and from the look on his face, it hit harder than any accusation or insult. 3 years ago, you humiliated me at Jake Whitfield's party," I continued. "You said I didn't meet your standards. Well, congratulations. You were right. I don't meet the standards of a criminal, a liar, and a cheat. I'm much better than that." I turned and walked toward the exit, not bothering to look back. Behind me, I could hear Caleb calling my name, but I didn't stop. I'd said everything I came to say. The drive back to the city gave me time to process the visit. Seeing Caleb in prison had been cathartic, but not in the way I'd expected. I'd thought I might feel satisfaction at his downfall or closure from our final conversation. Instead, I felt empty, as if I'd finally purged the last traces of our relationship from my system. By the time I reached the city limits, I was thinking about the future instead of the past. Rebecca Walsh's offer to join the Attorney General's office was still open, and I'd been considering it more seriously lately. I could continue performing surgery part-time while building a new career prosecuting white-collar criminals. My phone rang as I pulled into my driveway. The caller ID showed Eleanor Hartley's number. "Whitney, dear, how did it go?" she asked. "It went exactly as I expected," I replied. "He's still making excuses and playing the victim." "I'm sorry to hear that. I'd hoped that prison might have given him some perspective." Eleanor and I had maintained a cordial relationship since the trial. She'd moved to Florida as planned, but we talked occasionally, bound together by our shared experience of Caleb's betrayal. "How's the baby?" I asked. "Beautiful. Amanda named her Margaret after Mrs. Chin." "She's walking now, getting into everything. Amanda's doing well too. She finished her degree and got a job with a non-profit that helps single mothers." It was good to hear that something positive had come from the wreckage of Caleb's crimes. Baby Margaret would grow up never knowing her father, but she'd be better off for it. "Eleanor, I've made a decision," I said. "I'm going to take the job with the Attorney General's office. I want to prosecute white-collar criminals." "That's wonderful, dear. You'll be excellent at it." After hanging up, I sat in my car for a few minutes, looking at the house I'd shared with Caleb for 8 years. I'd redecorated extensively after the divorce, erasing all traces of his presence, but the memories lingered in every room. It was time for a fresh start. The next morning, I called Rebecca Walsh and accepted her offer. 2 weeks later, I started my new job as a prosecutor in the Attorney General's white-collar crime unit. My first case involved a doctor who had been billing Medicare for procedures he'd never performed, stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from the government healthcare system. It felt like coming home. 6 months into my new career, I received an unexpected phone call. Agent Patterson, the FBI agent who had arrested Caleb, was on the line. "Mrs. Anderson, I have some news that might interest you," she said. We've recovered an additional $12 million from Caleb's offshore accounts. The money will be distributed to his victims. It was the best news I'd heard in years. $12 million wouldn't make the victims whole, but it would significantly improve their situations. How much will Margaret Chin's estate receive? I asked. Approximately $400,000. It won't replace what was stolen, but it's something. I thought about Margaret Chin's niece, who had inherited her aunt's debts and modest belongings. $400,000 would be life-changing for her. There's something else, Agent Patterson continued. We've been tracking the money trail, and we've uncovered evidence of similar schemes operating in other cities. We could use someone with your expertise to help investigate and prosecute these cases. What kind of involvement are you talking about? Task force work. You'd be assigned to a joint FBI-DOJ unit that specializes in complex financial crimes. It would mean travel, but you'd be making a real difference in fighting this kind of fraud. I didn't hesitate. I'm interested. 3 months later, I was sworn in as a federal prosecutor specializing in securities fraud and elder abuse cases. My first assignment took me to Miami, where a group of investment advisors had been targeting retirees with fake cryptocurrency schemes. The work was challenging and rewarding in ways that surgery had never been. Every conviction meant that fewer innocent people would be victimized. Every recovered asset meant that someone's retirement might be salvaged. I thought about Caleb sometimes, sitting in his prison cell, counting down the years until his release. He'd be 63 when he got out, assuming he served his full sentence. An old man with no money, no reputation, and no prospects. But mostly, I didn't think about him at all. 5 years after his conviction, I received a letter from Amanda Harrison. She was married now, to a man who had adopted baby Margaret and loved her as his own daughter. They were living in Oregon, where Amanda worked for a victim advocacy organization and her husband taught elementary school. I wanted you to know that I named my daughter after Mrs. Chin, the letter said. Every day, I tell her about the brave woman whose name she carries, and about the other brave woman who made sure justice was done. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to do the right thing. I kept the letter in my desk drawer, along with thank you notes from other victims whose cases I'd helped prosecute. They were reminders of why the work mattered, why justice was worth fighting for even when it came at a personal cost. The revenge I'd taken on Caleb had been thorough and devastating, but it had also been just. He'd stolen from innocent people, and he'd paid the price for his crimes. More importantly, his downfall had prevented him from victimizing others and had led to the recovery of millions of dollars for his victims. I'd rebuilt my life on a foundation of truth and justice, using the skills I'd developed during 3 years of secret investigation to fight corruption wherever I found it. It wasn't the life I'd planned when I married Caleb Hartley, but it was a better life, one with meaning and purpose. Standing in my new office in the federal courthouse, looking out at the city where it all began, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. From suburban housewife to federal prosecutor, from victim to advocate, from broken heart to fierce warrior for justice. Caleb had been wrong about my standards. They were higher than he could ever imagine.